section, or in this session, what we will attempt to do is to address some ways in which modernity has been perceived and commented upon from a more traditionalist perspective, and how that might, in some sense, challenge or at least differ from the way in which moderns and postmoderns read modernity. And therefore, the text that we're going to be focused on is this text, The King of the Castle, written by Charles Gai Eaton, Sheikh Hassan Abdul Hakim, who was initiated by Sheikh Abu Bakr Sirajuddin, by Martin Lings. And it is a fascinating book and a very powerful book. And given that the book is written, in some sense, for believers, let's say for Muslims who are living in the modern world, it is an aid, it is a help for us in order to understand the tenets, the precepts, the presuppositions, the assumptions, the essential features of modernity, and how we may, in some sense, engage and in some sense perhaps remain truly faithful and faithful witnesses despite the challenges of modernity. So simply to walk us through it, because I think that some of you may not have had the chance to go through the entire chapter due to time pressures, but you can let me know. I mean, how many of you had the chance to read the full chapter in the last few days? There are going to also be maybe a couple other texts that I may refer to by traditionalist authors, okay, to complement what is being said or as way of commentary. I'm going to begin by going directly to the chapter, to the introduction, and we see that Shaykh Hassan actually begins with a Quranic verse. So I'm using it because it helps to frame and situate the entire book, and especially the introduction. So the Quranic verse is from Surah Al-Rahman, verse 26-27. Bismillah, it says, "All that is therein perishes, and there remains only the face of thy Lord." This is how he begins. This is how he begins to set the tone in terms of what he's actually doing. So when we see that, immediately what appears is that from a traditionalist perspective, what is most fundamental and what frames everything is the question of the one and the many. It has to do with the absolute and the relative. This is where it all begins. This is the primary concern. Other things which are fundamental, of course, in terms of sameness and otherness, union and separation, nearness and distance, they are all framed by the question of the one and the absolute one, and what this means, the one and the many. And this is why he chooses this verse at the very beginning. Now, Sheikh Hassan Abdul Hakim has a very engaging style. So he does not simply present philosophical precepts, but he often invites us to imagine a scene, and through the story that he tells, or through the image, he takes us along on the journey. The first thing that he does is he wants to, in some sense, actually open the question of why we should even engage the modern or modernity. And this is a wise move. So you begin with the question why. And in order to help us understand why we should even go on this journey, he asks us to do a kind of thought experiment. And he says, imagine that you could time travel. So imagine that there's a time machine. And let us all, so now we're all imagining live now, together. So we all get into this time machine, and how many of you are there? In the, I was going to say in the studio, but
I think
Bismillah.
14 people.
MashaAllah, MashaAllah. so there's enough room for everybody in the time machine. Okay, so now everyone is on board and we're traveling, and you can choose whichever period of time you want to stop in, as long as it is before the modern West, the onset of the modern West. So I would basically take it back to before 1400, if that's okay, before 1450. Okay, so we're going to go back, and we're going to stop at various points. I mean, you can go to Central Asia. You can even go to where you are right now. You see? So anywhere you would like to go, you stop there. And the claim that Sheikh Hassan is making is that if you were to do that, you would be bound to be somewhat shocked by how the people of that time not just live, but by some of their assumptions or the ways in which they see the world and what that is based on. And you would think it is quite strange, but when they actually see you, if you happen to be a modern, meaning you've totally prescribed to and bought into the way of modernity, and you really embody that, many of the things that Sayyid Omar was speaking about, you basically you embody a lot of those principles, but also manifestations. They would think you are totally strange. And it is not just, oh, this is fascinating and new. According to the author, it was as if you would be forced to call into question not just what they are doing, but their underlying precepts and assumptions, and they would do the same thing to you, to the point that a kind of dismissiveness would arise. You would ask the question, why? Not because you wanted to understand, but almost as if, why would any human live like this? That kind of why would be asked by you of them, and they would dismissively perhaps ask that of you. Now, if you do this kind of thought experiment and travel back in time, this is not necessarily going to bring you to a place of certainty. All it might do is simply to tell you that there are a bunch of different positions or perspectives that can be experienced. But the question of which one of these modes of reality is the true one, is the principial one, is still not going to be answered. Instead of traveling back in time, I mean, to complement what Sheikh Hassan is doing, let's take a trip not to another time, diachronically, but rather synchronically at this time to different places here on the planet. You would also be presented with different languages, cultural assumptions, and so on and so forth. And when you experience those different cultures and languages and foods and assumptions, you would still say, well, okay, there are many different options here. But the question of whether there's a principle to which they should adhere in terms of validity of their truth is not going to be questioned. So it's just multiplicity. Therefore, the next move is going to be made by the author. The author is going to tell us in the opening page that all of the practices and the possibilities that are before us in our time, in our place, in our culture, and those that are available to people of different times are based on certain assumptions, and those possibilities are based on a certain purpose that those people have. Okay? This is a bit similar to what Sayyid Omar was saying about teleology, right? It is a kind of purpose that draws you forth. So the different options, the different possibilities in our culture are going to be based on different ideas of what the purpose is, maybe the purpose of life or the highest good. And those purposes, he says, are often based on assumptions that we simply take for granted in our culture. They're not necessarily examined because we live our daily lives, our day-to-day lives. We take actions based on purposes. Those purposes are determined by various unquestioned assumptions. And he says, okay, everyone has their unquestioned assumptions probably. That still doesn't get us far enough, you see? That still doesn't really tell us whether the way that we are living is dignified and true as a human being. You're still caught up in a kind of structure. Manifestations are based on certain purposes, those purposes based on assumptions. Yes, but then you can say it's all just variety and difference. All of them are still okay. What's the point? So let us continue. He says that what the game that we're playing up to this point is a kind of rational game, right? So I can go and I can look at those differences. I can experience different cultures. I can consider and analyze some of their assumptions. But he makes a very, very important point on page 8. He tells us that your thoughts and your rational thought cannot derive its substance from itself. That means you can think about realities, but thinking itself, meaning this is what Sayyid Omar was saying about Descartes, thinking itself cannot provide itself with its own substance. So he says that rational thinking is dependent on something, and that something gives it its assumptions. For example, he says, even if you're a great thinker, you come into a room, this is the example that the author uses, and you happen initially to somehow mistake a coil of rope for a snake. Now, when you make that first assumption, you know, it's a mistaken assumption, but you move on quickly. You move on very, very quickly, and you're able to provide your audience with a beautiful description of all of the facets, right, of that so-called snake. You describe it fully, but the whole time you've actually mistaken it. So that's why rational elucidation, he says, is not going to basically be of help when we engage in this experiment of what it means to be modern, what are its precepts, and what it means to live traditionally. There has to be something else which helps to ground us. If I offer some quotes, for example, he says, when you make that initial mistake, from that point on, your logic may be impeccable, perfect, and your behavior might be very reasonable, but you're still wrong based on the initial mistake. And it's the basic assumptions which determine all the rest. When it comes to Descartes, so Sayyid Omar mentioned Descartes. Descartes himself says that when he actually, in some sense, wanted to find the ground of certainty by using the method of doubt, by calling everything that he possibly could into doubt, he was, in some sense, encouraged to go on to this project to establish the foundations of thought by an angel that he saw in a dream. So he initially says that he actually had a dream in which an angel told him to go and pursue this project of establishing the foundations of thought. But after that initial moment of seeing that in a journal, we have this where he actually writes this, he never comes back. He never comes back to it. He simply then goes on and engages in his own process without realizing that that initial moment is not something that he could have reduced to his own thinking. So in very similar fashion here, the author is helping to make us aware of the fact that simply sitting there and in some sense polemically and dogmatically, let's say fighting, the fighting that goes on between tradition and modernity cannot be settled at the rational level, and no amount of rational discourse is going to settle the matter. So this is just by way of saying that the two positions, according to the author, first of all, are so radically different, and second of all, cannot merely be let's say, resolved at the rational level. So we need something more. So now, the author introduces his own intention. This is still on page, I believe on page 8. The author, is that okay? Are we on the same page, by the way, when I say page 8? Is that okay? The same, okay. The same edition, all right. Fundamental in terms of the purpose, you know, introducing the purpose and the intention. Because of what has been said so far, he says that it is fundamental, and his intention is to take a, quote, long and hard look at some of the basic assumptions of our age, to question the unquestionable, meaning some things that have become dogmas of the age, and 3, to cast doubt upon propositions which appear self-evident. Meaning everything appears to be so normal that what Plato, for example, through Socrates, quoting Socrates, has said, meaning the unexamined life is not worth living. The unexamined life is not worth living is not really happening for various reasons. Some people say we do not have time for it. Some people say, why should I even question anything? I mean, we are the most reflective people of any age, we moderns, you know. So many people do not question the ground assumptions. And he says that this is his intention. This is what the author is saying. But we also cannot simply examine the fundamental assumptions of modernity from a vacuum, he says, from a no man's land. This is sort of what Sayyid Omar was also saying, that even those who claim, for example, to be traditional, by virtue of living in the modern age, the question is, am I not already conditioned by it? So he takes up this challenge. He takes up the challenge. He's like, well, is it really possible? Is it really possible to do an objective critical examination of the modern and its precepts? He says, well, everyone is conditioned by their age, by their time, by the place in which they live. But out of all of the creatures that exist, out of all of the beings that are in existence, it is the human being, quote, right? So he says, I'm going to quote this. He says, quote, it is not easy to break free, but precisely because we are human, it is not impossible. So that means don't think that the task of doing a critical examination, especially of modernity, is going to be an easy task, but it is also not an impossible task. It's not what most people are going to engage in, but the masters of traditional wisdom, so those who also have been influential in Sheikh Hassan Abdul Hakim's life, going to Sheikh Abdul Wahid, Sheikh Isa, Sheikh Abu Bakr, and so on and so forth. They, of course, have not had it easy either. They've been in a kind of, you know, I mean, really, an extreme minority, you could say, compared to those who are the proponents of modernity. But it is still possible because a measure of detachment, he says, it's the human being who can actually practice a measure of detachment in terms of contemplation. And this is what the author is proposing to do. He says that one must have firm ground beneath one's feet in order to take up the matter. And to diagnose the ills of the time, one must possess standards of health, right? So if I myself am drunk and ill with modernity and drunk on its precepts, it is going to be very difficult for me to offer a critical, objective reading. So that was basically the author's intention, and making us, in some sense, aware of why it is important to take this journey, because these days a plurality of perspectives abide, and it is as if all of them are equal, or the modern is given full advantage against everything that existed before it. We cannot do things simply based on a kind of rational examination. Therefore, we need to ground ourselves in something which is more certain. But now the question comes, how shall we do this? So the next move that the author makes is he wants to, in some sense, establish basically the approach, the point of view, the method that we're going to use on this journey. And I should say that when I discussed this with Sayyid Rizwan Zamir, so Sidi Abdul Majid, I mean, the recommendation of this book, the introduction is great because it sets up, let's say, the landscape, and it very much corresponds, inshallah, also to the intention of the program. But there are also then chapters in the book which very nicely complements the different units of your program, of the 2-year program. So, for example, chapter 2, the cost of wealth, dealing with perhaps a traditional reading of modern economy. Liberty and obedience, chapter 3, a traditional reading of government and politics. Man in society, knowledge and its counterfeits. For example, the question of knowledge and epistemology. So by us basically touching on some of the elements in the intro, I hope it also sets us up for to come in the program, and those chapters can also then be used. Again, the approach and the method. How is the author going to take us on this journey? Well, he sets out, and basically now is identifying his own position and the perspective from which the book is going to be written. Page 8 to page 9, at the bottom, I'm at the bottom of page 8, going on to page 9. The first thing is that he's going to write from an Islamic perspective. He says it doesn't that everyone who is Muslim is going to agree with him, but what kind of Islamic perspective are we talking about? So first, method of the author. He's writing, or his approach, his perspective is Islamic. Number 2, what kind of Islam are we talking about? We're talking about a perennialist or a traditionalist approach to Islam and to religion. But what does that entail? What does that mean? He says, quote, "It is founded upon a belief in the essential unity of the great religions as deriving from a single source of revelation and in a perennial wisdom expressed not only in the religions, but also in the myths and symbols of ancient peoples. A wisdom which may be said to inhere in the deepest level of our being, so that we need only to be reminded of it in order to rediscover the truth within ourselves." And he says that this is in line with the Islamic perspective. So we might, in some sense, say that the vision here corresponds to the Deen al-Fitra. So the primordial religion, of which Islam, as the final pronouncement or reiteration of it, is the perfect crystallization. So this is basically the perspective that the Shaykh is taking. He's being very clear. He's saying that this is, okay, where I'm coming from. But last but not least, the way he's going to approach this is, in a certain sense, with great concern for the question of the immutable norms and principles which establish what it means to be human. We might call them, he is searching in this book. The approach, in a certain sense, is one of the seeker who is searching for an immutable norm of human normalcy. What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be human across all ages? So what is fundamentally essential about the human condition? And this means that the initial thought experiment of traveling back in time and so on is now no longer about a variety of relativistic positions, but the question is whether there is one essential nature of humanity which we can use as a standard through our travels in time and space. Okay, so these things, these 3 elements are fundamental to the method of the author and how he's going to examine modernity and modernization. Okay? Are we okay so far in terms of how he's setting up the journey? So if there are any questions, Bismillah.
Any clarification?
Bismillah. So now that he has set up the framework, and the next move is fascinatingly enough, he starts. It is a bit unusual, I think, for the author to actually say that there is something that we do have in common, you know, as let's say Muslim believers. Is there anything that we do have in common, right, with the person who subscribes to the precepts, manifestations of modernity? And interestingly enough, he says, yes, there is. He says, yes, there is. Both those who live in the modern world and prescribe to, are in agreement with, totally on the bus of modernity. They even believe that it is a bit abnormal. It's like a bit strange. Some of the things are almost beyond recognition. Every day something new pops up. He does not use the word exceptional, but I think that it might be the word. There's something exceptional. Now, again, like Sayyid Omar was saying, many of the things that I'm going to say, I don't mean to fill it up with value. When I say exceptional, I do not mean, for example, exceptional in a necessarily positive sense or value. Someone performs exceptionally well on an exam and gets a 99%. That's not what we mean. But we mean that it is a kind of outlier, that it somehow seems not to belong, or it seems radically odd and different from what we have experienced as human beings in other ages. So he says this point we can all agree on, that somehow it is so radically different, radically strange. How we actually approach it, though, afterwards, now that we have admitted this as, let's say, believing Muslims who might live in Pakistan, in Iran, in whichever land it might be, versus those living in the modern West as moderns, he says, despite the fact that we recognize this strangeness, the modern man is going to do something even stranger. And what is that? He says, and yet, you know, despite this mishappen creature, meaning the one who does not examine his or her own assumptions, this accidental being who just goes along with things, despite the strangeness, this person is fully convinced that he is what man always was meant to be. And he defines human nature in terms of his own nature, his own weaknesses, and his own vices. Now, based on the course that some of you were, participated in the Quest for Knowledge course, and then more importantly, since that time in the book circle led by Sidi Taimur on the Book of Certainty by Sheikh Abu Bakr. And one of the most fundamental things is that God, man, and nature, meaning these three levels of reality, the metaphysical, then human nature, and then the microcosmos, and then the macrocosmos at large, traditionally are seen in some sense to be in union and communion. There's communion. There's interpenetration going on. And we are told, I mean, there's a prophetic hadith, but also biblically, that the human being is made in the image of, or in the form of God. Now, what the Shaykh is saying here, though, is that for the modern, we could in some sense simplify it and simply say that for the modern, man is created in the image of man. I mean, maybe that's the simplest way of putting what he is saying in this part, that the modern man does not see himself made in the image of God, but simply as made in his own image. And where is he going to get where is he going to get his assumptions from? Where is he going to get his precepts from? He knows that there is something radically strange and odd about what is going on in his age, and yet he's not going to look beyond himself. So this is one of the signs that is pointed out at the beginning, one of the tendencies of the modern that we might note down. And it might be helpful, I think, as we go along, for you to also take notes, and maybe we might share them at some point, because it could be that in my own notes, I also maybe have not been able to express it as clearly as now, because I think there is this dynamic when we come together and converse, that some of the points become much more clear. So if you could do that for our well-being, all of us. So again, the human being is not defined in the image of God, but in his own image. Defines himself, quote, it says he defines this in terms of current progressive ideals. So even though he admits that there's so much wrong with the world, and we're in the middle of endless crises, there's a financial crisis, there's an environmental crisis, we have corruption, so there are political crises. Day and night, we're drowning in crises, and yet somehow the modern man who does not examine his or her own beliefs in modernity simply goes along, and he still defines himself based on that. I'm going to quote page 9 to page 10, again, from the author. Quote, this is an important one. He says, to suggest to him, right? Now, imagine that you're engaging a person who is fully on board with modernity and its assumptions. And we are trying to face this person. It is so sticky. Even people who say that, yeah, there's something wrong, in fact, there are innumerable crises, still at the end of the day say, well, but you know what? We've made so much progress compared to those ignorant people in pre-modern times. So we're dealing with something which is really sticky. No matter how much you try to take it off of yourself in the modern age, you see, when you inhabit the modern world, it tends to stick upon you, and oftentimes we do not even realize that we're in it. So it tends to be very innocuous, meaning it sneaks in invisible ways, and just like the glasses through which I'm now seeing you, it becomes basically a lens through which I experience the world. And to be able to take off, you see, the lens of modernity and actually examine it is therefore all the more important, because it tends to hide itself. And it becomes so normalized. It is so, you see, it is so pervasive, we could say, that even when you say, yeah, of course that's not right, still, it's still there. You see? So it's not just a matter of consciously identifying things. I think a greater question, probably through the 2-year program, is what therefore is to be done when we're facing something which is so pervasive that it informs many of the ways that even those of us who might be, let's say, converted or convinced by tradition are living in a modern world. Okay? So here is a very fundamental quote, what we just mentioned, just to show you how pervasive it is and how difficult it is to get away from it. Now, if we, as those who might basically be convinced of the precepts of tradition, pose a challenge to, call into question the precepts of the modern, again, we're going to be seen as irrational or perhaps crazy, not by those of a different age now, but by those moderns who inhabit this very world. You see? So now it's no longer time travel. We now coexist. But those who hold different positions, he says, it has gotten to the point where the different ways of life and the different precepts that we believe in and that we embody have almost become unable to communicate with one another, so that the modern and the traditional really stand at odds. We're not talking about a neutral difference of degrees. The way that he is describing the story, Sheikh Hassan Abdul Hakim, the way he's describing it is as a radical difference which you simply cannot overcome. Okay, you cannot have a very peaceful dialogue just by sitting at the table and saying, yes, we're all right. That's not going to do it. One of the things that that is then, I think, that he uses to illuminate the difference. You see, he's now getting to some of the differences between the traditional perspective, or how traditional men, especially the Muslim, and when he says man, by the way, we should also highlight the fact that in some sense he means the human, right? So he does not basically always say man/woman, but he means the human as such. And in German, for example, there are two different words which are used. I'm coming to you from basically Germany right now, and the word Mensch, for example, is used. Now, Mensch just means human, but Mann and Frau, it's man and woman. You see, so when he mentions this, please do not be alarmed. So it is still inclusive language from a traditional perspective. One of the things that he now does to show you the radical difference and how the two positions are incommensurable, meaning you cannot bring them together and simply build a wishy-washy bridge between the differences, is by looking at what we could call the eschaton, meaning those things having to do with the ultimate nature of reality, as well as the end times, right? Eschatology has to do with things of the end times, meaning death, the hereafter, and the day of judgment. So let us, in the way of the author, imagine this. What would be heaven and what would be hell for the modern man, for the modern human being? And what would be heaven, and in some sense, what would be hell for the one who is of a traditional perspective? So he lays this out, again, to simply make the point that communication is really embattled, extremely difficult between the two perspectives. Based on what he says on page 10, we could in some sense comment upon it and summarize it as this, that as long as I am free to pursue my self's or lower self's desires and wishes with my willpower and with tools that help me acquire the object of my desire, things are wonderful. It could get better, of course, insofar as I make the process more efficient, for example, through machines and through technologies that allow me to get more in less time. Therefore, the instrumentalized reason and efficiency thinking that Sayyid Omar referred to. Now, I can continue, and if I can ensure that this process goes on sustainably, long time, and call it sustainable growth, that's heaven. See, so for the fallen modern man, this would be the ideal thing. Now, everything which gets in the way of my own ego or lower self's will, if I'm not free to choose my own destiny, so to say, if not enough technologies to help me maximize profit and acquisition, all of those things would almost be like hell, you see, because it gets in the way. So I have to find ways to solve it. But he contrasts this modern perspective with, again, the traditional Islamic perspective. And here is where he basically tells us that for the traditional Muslim, it's not really about acquiring things in this life and maximizing it, simply because you view the passage through worldly life, meaning the dunya, in light of that ocean of reality which is infinite and which encompasses it. So he says, quote on page 10, the Muslim does not easily forget that, as men and women, we are all doomed, quote, since we must surely die, and that societies, civilizations, and worlds are equally mortal. So this fear of death and this desire to gain more, that's not what the Muslim is really afraid of. There's a different concern. There's a much different concern. And therefore he quotes the Quranic verse 55:27, Bismillah, he says, everything that is upon the earth passes away and remains only the face of thy Lord. infinite in glory, and infinite in bounty. So the concern for that which is transient and passes away in the dunya versus the concern for the one who is infinite and who shall remain after all things have actually passed away. The obsession with one versus the obsession with the other. So we might say that there's a great deal of selfishness, meaning the notion of the fallen self, he's going to get to that, the fallen human, which is at work here. And so many of the different aspects that one could touch upon, the way that Sayyid Omar was talking, touching upon different manifestations or different aspects of modernity, we could say that ultimately you can reduce them to the way in which the fallen self, the fallen human, is experiencing reality with a very reduced consciousness. Based on what we said, meaning the primary concern, the world is my primary concern, basically establishing or achieving maximal acquisition and happiness for my lower self in the dunya, in the world, or is it actually to become more and more selfless on the journey to God? Those two things, there are infinite varieties of one, there are infinite varieties of the other. When you look at the trajectories that they're going in, they seem diametrically opposed. We could simply say that up to this point, based on what the author is saying. And he says that please do not fall for this trap and this trick that the modern man is so ethically concerned about the future of mankind. Why does he say this? Why does he say this? Precisely because of what we said earlier in terms of sustainable growth. If you can maximize your own profit, whether they be material or whether you're talking about reputation or whatever, then the concern for the future, he says, is there. But he likens this with another beautiful image. So mashallah, in terms of imagery, the writing is very, very rich, and he helps us imagine this. He says, imagine an actor who is playing in a theater, and now he's concerned about his own piece, you see, and how much longer he can actually perform that piece in front of the people, maybe. But his concern is not about the theater. So he doesn't really care about whether the theater stands or not, and so on. It's just his own act that he's really interested in. So in a certain sense, there is no fundamental real hereafter. There's only the short-term hereafter in terms of his own desires and his own successes, personal. Whereas, again, the traditional Muslim, according to the author, realizes that things are not in his own hands, but entrusts it also to the hands of God, and therefore this fear and agony that I am mortal and death is coming, and I have to acquire as much as possible and try to extend my life and so on, is not going to be the fundamental concern of the traditional human being. Okay, so far, so this was a second segment, perhaps. Any points of clarification up to this point? Now we reach a very important point. I mean, we've been pointing towards this already now in the commentary and the discussion so far, but we reach a fundamental point. On page 10, there's a quote. The author says that the main concern of the book, the heart of the book, here we have it, quote, what it means to be a man that is a human in terms of the traditional view of human nature. You see? So this is, the big question is, what does it mean to truly and fully be human from a traditionalist perspective? This is the heart of it. And perhaps we can say that it is the heart of it all, because if we do not have a reliable, immutable standard and scale from which to look at the different perspectives, we're only going to fall into a kind of judgmental or flat relativism. Either you're going to say that all perspectives are the same, a flat relativism, a flat pluralism, you could call it, Or one of the perspectives out of many is going to come and through various constructs and ideologies try to assert itself and destroy the others, which is totalitarianism. So to save us from relativism and to save us from totalitarianism of a false order, the Sheikh is proposing that we actually go and find out what it truly means to be human by doing deep examination from a traditionalist perspective. Because if we do that, things may become clearer. Okay? So the reason why it is important to lay this out first. And as we have said, he says that there is no common ground. So we have to be really careful. You know, he says there is no common ground between this view, meaning the traditional, and the image which the modern man of our time sees in the mirror of his own making. But what does the modern man see in the mirror when he looks upon himself? What is that own constructed image of the modern? Here it is. This is what he says. Image that the modern man sees, which is of his own making, is as follows. A clever animal born to exploit the earth's wealth, whether for his own enjoyment or in the service of his society, until his little light is extinguished and darkness takes him. So it sounds rather selfish and rather tragic. You see? It's a very selfish and tragic story at the end of the day, the way the author is presenting it. This is then contrasted with the traditional or the traditionalist view of what it means to be human and the function that we have. He says, quote, the fulfillment of the human function is to live as a symbol rather than as a transient individuality. And to live in this way is, in a certain sense, to represent man as such. Now, in the reading circle on the Book of Certainty, there is a chapter in the Book of Certainty by Sheikh Abu Bakr about the symbol. And so I would refer you to that because it is the best description and explication that I have seen, you know, from a traditionalist perspective about what it means to be a symbol. But one thing we can say is that there is definitely a verticality, and a symbol is that which comes from the one and points us back to the one. And in order to refer to the symbol, I'm going to quote directly from, if that is okay, from Sheikh Abu Bakr, just so as a kind of comment. What is remarkable is that Sheikh Abu Bakr, of course, connects this to Dhikrullah, one thing, and he also connects it to a Quranic verse, right? It's Quran 14, verse 24 to 25, where it is said, Bismillah, seest thou not how God citeth a symbol? A good word is as good as a good tree, its roots set firm and its branches in heaven, giving its fruit at every season by the leave of its Lord. God citeth symbols for men that they may remember. So basically, where we are in terms of this book, the notion is that the human being fundamentally is a symbol, one who comes from God and in some sense points back to him. And that is the function, to be in remembrance of the origin and the end. At the end of the chapter here in the Book of Certainty, Sheikh Abu Bakr then cites another verse, and we might say that this is what perhaps Sheikh Hassan Abdul Hakim, in some sense, might use to refer to what is happening now for modern man. And the verse that verse is Quran 14, verse 26. Bismillah. It says, a bad word is as a bad tree which lies uprooted on the surface of the earth. So here there is basically no verticality. Things refer to one another. Different aspects, for example, of the ideology of communism, how it came about, who said what, you know, the leftist Hegelians and how it gave rise to what Marx and Engels did. You have thousands and thousands of intricate pointing here, pointing there. But what often happens is that the verticality of basically us coming from God and returning to our origin does not really happen. So this is one of those fundamental points, again, which the Sheikh actually makes, and to show that we are talking about diametrically opposed modes. As we move on, we are also told. Now, you know, see, now his commentary is becoming much more explicit. So we also have to remember, this, that given that usually, the modern reads basically the traditional and the religious in a very dismissive fashion and tries to say it is outmoded, outdated, irrelevant, useless, abstract, and so on and so forth. What the Sheikh is doing, he is saying that, okay, allow me, step by step, to offer a traditionalist Islamic reading of the modern now. You see? So, and the way that he does it, more and more comes to the fore. With each passing page, I think, hopefully, in your first reading, you saw that his writing becomes much more intense, the images become much more explicit, and so on. And we get a sense of inversion that is happening. You see, he's taking us along with him. So, decisive quotes on page 11. So, basically, since he says we are fragmentary, it is wholeness that he seeks in order to become what in truth he is. So that the traditional person who believes, the believer, is seeking wholeness. He doesn't want to stay fragmented in this world. He continues, he says the fragmentary being left to his own devices and without a model, a masterless man. Beautiful, this is remarkable, a masterless man. I mean, a modern man often pushes away and cuts himself off from the masters of tradition and of the past. Therefore, he calls him a masterless man. The masterless man is seen as a stray dog foraging on the outskirts of the human village. Usually, modern man basically points everything back to himself. He sees other ages to be on the periphery, and he himself as the center. We could call this what? Being self-centered. You see? But of course, the self being the fallen self. And he is saying that in reality, it is precisely the opposite. Meaning from a theomorphic perspective of God being in the center and man being the mirror of God and trying to approach the center, the modern man would be the one who is in some sense not perhaps even on the circumference. He's just wandering out and in some dark village for himself like a stray dog because he does not accept the master. He decides that he's going to invent everything in his own name. And when you look at the early writings, even of René Descartes, that Sayyid Omar referred to, the whole notion that I'm not going to rely upon anything as if those things are superstitious and biased, it is already a kind of cutting off. You see, perhaps I'll just quote one thing, and then inshallah we can go to a question answer. That is wonderful, thank you. Maybe two things, because there were a few texts. Again, Sheikh Abu Bakr, I believe, the last work that he put together, right, the underlying religion, this is also a resource which I would recommend. And the very first part of it is also called Tradition and Modernity, Lord Northburn, 3 essays there. So highly recommended, Lord Northburn, 3 essays, Tradition and Modernity, in Martin Ling's The Underlying Religion.
We can share that. We can share that
yes.
with the group.
Exactly, there's that. Then, of course, the book that we are reading. And last but not least, I'm going to just read a basic, very basic part for you, perhaps as a kind of summary. It's from Sayyid Hossein Nasr, and this one is called Reflections on Islam and Modern Thought. Okay? It's a kind of essay I got it from the Studies in Comparative Religion, so it's available online. And just two quotes, okay? Two quotes, basically, again, to highlight the differences that we are dealing with and why it is so important for us to deal in such, you know, we're not doing a course, we're doing a 2-year program, see? So subhanAllah, why is it necessary to take 2 years to deal with this? You might ask yourself. So I think these two quotes here that I'm going to share with you might highlight this. He says, quote, "When we use the term modern, we mean neither contemporary, nor up-to-date, nor successful in the conquest and domination of the natural world. No. Rather, for us, meaning for traditionalists, modern means that which is cut off from the transcendent, from the immutable principles, which in reality govern all things and which are made known to man through revelation in its most universal sense. Modernism is thus contrasted with tradition, al-din. The latter, meaning deen, implies all that which is of divine origin, along with its manifestations and deployments on the human plane, while the former, namely the ideology of modernity, by contrast, implies all that is merely human and now ever more increasingly subhuman, and all that is divorced and cut off from the divine source." Okay, this is one quote which I think really highlights also what Sheikh Hassan Abdul Hakim is saying, meaning everything is reduced to the fallen man's mode of consciousness at the end. And one more before we go to question answer. The end of this essay by Sayyid Hussein Nasr is this. He says, "In conclusion, it is necessary to mention that the reductionism, which is one of the characteristics of modern thought, has itself affected Islam in its confrontation with modernism. One of the effects of modernism upon Islam has been to reduce Islam in the minds of many to only one of its dimensions, namely the Sharia, or we could say the legalistic, and to divest it of those intellectual weapons which alone can withstand the assault of modern thought upon the citadel of Islam. The Sharia is, of course, basic to the Islamic tradition. It is the ground upon which religion is based. But the intellectual challenges posed by modernism in the form of evolutionism, rationalism, existentialism, agnosticism, and the like can only be answered intellectually and not juridically, nor by ignoring or disregarding them and expecting some kind of magical wedding between the Sharia and modern science and technology. The successful encounter of Islam with modern thought can only come about when modern thought is fully understood in both its roots and ramifications, and the whole of the Islamic tradition brought to bear upon the solution of the enormous problems which modernism poses for Islam. At the center of this undertaking lies the revival of that wisdom, that hikmah or haqiqah, which lies at the heart of the Islamic revelation, and which will remain valid as long as men and women remain men and women and bear witness to him, to God, according to their theomorphic nature, not their fallen nature, and their state of servitude before the Lord, ubudiyah, the state which is the raison d'être, the reason of human existence, right? So this in some sense presents the challenges, you know, we are faced with challenges which simply at the legalistic and ideological level of Islam cannot be met. And the likes of Sheikh Hassan, Sheikh Abu Bakr, and the traditionalists, they in some sense go, they try to go to the heart of the intellect and not mere reason. There's a verticality which they are relying upon to help illuminate the deviances of modernity, and so that in some sense Muslims actually can inhabit tradition in the modern world. So I'll leave it there, and we didn't go through the whole chapter, but at least some of the key points which orient the entire work here, and perhaps can be of help when as we take our journey.
Excellent, Aga. I think you can sense that there will be many questions.